These slides are intended to give you a visual reference for some of the readings and materials on African American quilting as a distinctive craft tradition in the United States. Now, African American women's quilting displays a wide range of eclecticism, embracing many styles and techniques, so we want to be careful about generalizing too much about Black women's quilting in general. But within the range of these quilters' works, we can identify a significant body of material that shares a common sensibility, a common aesthetic, if you will. There's been a lot written about African American quilts. I'll try to summarize some of the directions in which that work has gone, but not attempt to synthesize it here. When we encounter a certain kind of traditional African American quilt, we're struck right away by a very specific sense of style that the quilt has. And this style is distinctive from other traditions of American quilting, especially those along Anglo or European traditions. African American quilting emerged historically from a syncretic, creolized process combining some African and European quilting techniques along with a West African sensibility about textile construction and appearance. So take a look at this quilt. The pieces are not necessarily uniform or mathematically cut or joined in a super precise way. The strips of cloth are often different widths or different lengths. There may be more than one kind of fabric included. Flour sack, printed or cotton, solid cotton, corduroy, even fragments of knitting. The pattern is often asymmetrical and may appear haphazard. There's almost a kind of sense of rhythm or movement to this quilt that is created by the differing lengths and widths of the strips and the ways in which the colors of the squares are arranged. Other examples of quilts may show stitching that is very broad or uneven, not the tiny, really precise stitching that we often see associated with quilting. Here's an example of a quilt from Gee's Bend, which incorporates flour sack and printed in solid cotton. Again, incorporating different materials. And we notice that it's a kind of related to a log cabin quilt square, but they're arranged again in this kind of rhythmic fashion across the white backing. This improvisational quality is something that we'll see again and again. And this quilt on the left is actually a good example of that improvisational character we see. It's a strip quilt in which we have many different widths and lengths of fabric strips that are arranged in a rough approximation of a rectangle. But again, it's not uniform. It's not super precise. Now, at one time, racist cultural critics might have said, well, maybe the seamstress wasn't just that good. But we know for a fact that this is not an issue of skill, because from the very beginning, enslaved women made quilts for those who held them in bondage, as well as for themselves. These quilts are some examples from Gladys Marie Fry's book, Stitched from the Soul, which was the first book to really focus on quilts made by enslaved women. On the left, we see two appliqued quilts that were made by enslaved women for the plantation household. And the three quilts on the right are examples of quilts that enslaved women made for themselves. African American seamstresses on the plantation were extremely versatile and skilled sewers who could work in any number of stylistic forms. Yes, they might have been constrained by the available materials that they had, but this was also something that became a part of the aesthetic. They chose to make these quilts this way. They chose to make them differently. And here, in that choice, is where our aesthetic lies. And I would just note that in the bottom right-hand quilt, there is actually a blue piece of like a V-shaped fabric. That's actually a piece of knitting that was incorporated. It's very distinct from the rest of the fabric in the quilt. There are two styles of African American quilting that are tied to technique. The first of these is appliqued quilts. This is where you have a cutout of fabric that you then put onto a backing and hem and sew. And these are often we saw some examples in the prior slide of the flowers, and this is an example of Harriet Powers quilting. Now, this can be traced to a number of different sources. There was a tradition of appliqued quilting in Anglo-American tradition, and Harriet Powers may very well have been working in that. But we also know that there is a tradition of applique in West Africa as well. Here we can say that there's the definite link aesthetically to the abome applique tapestries that were practiced in the Dahomey Kingdom of Benin in the 3 centuries before French colonization, by the Fon people, who used the term nuta do nume to further explain what this applique work entails. Translating to highlighting of one thing by another, it reflects how the colorful motifs were added to a monochromatic backcloth to enhance the figures. Motifs are designs cut out of cotton fabric depicting objects, humans, plants, maybe the king's insignia back in the day, and animals. This art saw its fluorescence 3 centuries before colonization. And interestingly, this applique work was traditionally done by men, not women. They belonged to a guild that passed on the design knowledge through their lineage. Once commissioned, they would create the applique cloth and fashion items for those of high social societal status. And I think we can see that between this slide and this slide, there is in fact a very strong aesthetic similarity in terms of how the figures are rendered, and the way, and as well as the technique itself. Some people have also suggested that some of the symbols in Powers and others' quilts, the suns, for instance, may have African sources in Bakongo cosmology or other West African pictogram traditions. Powers took her subject from biblical stories and oral tradition, and this is an example of another one of her pictorial quilts. Now, there's been some speculation by a variety of different scholars about the meaning of symbolism in African American quilting, and there are a range of ideas and symbols here. On the one hand, some scholars have linked patterns in African American quilts specific to West African pictograms. So we see here in the bottom left-hand corner of this slide some examples of the Nsibidi pictogram tradition of southern Nigeria. We can also see that there's the Bakongo cosmogram in the upper right-hand corner, which has also been linked to the crossroads theme in Black American folklore. And we can also see some similarities between, say, Powers' work and this raffia cloth in the bottom right-hand corner. But we also see symbols that could be linked to the environment of the agricultural South, such as wagon wheels, bear's claws, the drunkard's path, and flying geese. Oral traditions suggest such images might also have been used as a mode of communication in the plantation environment, or even specifically to help guide a fugitive along the Underground Railroad. The picture on these slides are from a particular work about a quilter named Zelda Mcdaniel Williams, who worked out of Charleston, South Carolina. Ms. Williams had passed down through her family both the quilt's patterns as well as a specific story about a quilt code that she had inherited from her family, that she told to the authors of this book, Hidden in Plain View. And we can see here the drunkard's path, we can see the bear paw, the log cabin, and some of the other symbols explicated here on the page from the book. One area where there's almost universal agreement among most of the people who write about African American quilts is that a lot of African American quilting, specifically the pieced quilt or strip quilt, is linked aesthetically to West African textile designs, most specifically woven strip textiles. And this is a technique that's pretty common across different parts of West Africa, and also specifically practiced in Nigeria. On the left, we have an African American strip quilt, and on the right, we have an African American woven strip textile. And you can see that there's a fair amount of similarity aesthetically here in terms of how the design is conceived of. And we see similar similarities here. The upper left-hand image is of an African cloth, and then below in the bottom right left-hand corner, we have a strip quilt made by Miss Williams, who I just mentioned. And then we have here on the right 2 examples of Nigerian strip textile, a costume made from strips of fabric, and then a woven strip cloth. And here's another example of a multi-directional strip quilt. And this is another thing that's kind of interesting about some of these African American quilts, is that there's a lot of movement because strips of fabric are going in different directions as well. There's no sort of like clear path necessarily through, but there's a lot of moving around in the feeling of the cloth. And again, this is very typical. Perhaps the most famous of these kinds of quilts were those made by the makers of Gee's Bend, a small African-American community in Alabama, where these skills have been passed down throughout this community for at least 6 generations. And the Gee's Bend quilters are extremely well known at this point. Their work has been exhibited all over the country. When we look at these quilts, there's an emphasis on flexibility, approximation, and a kind of improvisation in how they are created or laid out. There's also there's examples of this kind of quilting tradition all over the country, and especially concentrated in the United States South. And so these quilting traditions have been documented by a number of folklife programs throughout the South. In Louisiana, there was an extensive documentation of African-American quilters by the Louisiana Folklife Program. Here we have this pieced quilt. Upper left is the top. Bottom left is the backing in a strip style. And again, we can see, this also in the log cabin quilt on the right. Again, this feeling of improvisation continued. This aesthetic is continued to quilters to this day. The emphasis on improvisation and creative process emerges in the words of the quilters themselves as well. Here's a distinctive quilt that incorporates both squared piecing as well as log cabin squares and strips into the design. This quilt was made by Ms. Rosie Jackson of Louisiana. And Miss Jackson, when she was asked about how she made this quilt, she said, "I just studied about a way to fix it up and put in the blocks in the center and then the strips around it. I was just studying a way to fix it. I wasn't studying nothing fancy." And here we get a little insight into how her creative process, that she starts with the center and then just kind of works out in this improvisational way out from there. Jackson suggests that she just started to work and improvised the design out of what she had. I want to end by showing a few examples of contemporary African-American quilting, which, although again quite diverse, often shows signs of continuity with the vernacular aesthetic. And this carries over into more formal quilting groups across the country. This is Purple Haze by Jacqueline Hughes Mooney from New Orleans. Here's another, An Ode to Harriet Powers by Peggy Hartwell from New York. And both these quilters, I think, are very self-consciously working with an understanding of this history and this vernacular tradition. We also see in contemporary context quilting used, as it also was during the Civil Rights Movement era, as a form of contemporary social and political commentary. In this case, there's a whole movement to create and showcase quilts related to the Black Lives Matter movement. And here are 2 examples here of that. I've Lived with Injustice All My Life by Ed Janetta Miller from Hartford, Connecticut, and Say Their Name by Tambra Chisholm in Baltimore, Maryland. And there's actually a link to a project these quilts are from called We Are the Story, A Visual Response to Racism, which is emanating out of Minneapolis since the summer of 2020, a group of quilters committed to racial justice. And we see in these works as well some of that aesthetic, that vernacular aesthetic in the asymmetrical improvisational quality, accommodating off-site pieces, string and strip construction, multiple patterns, and sometimes even the use of different kinds of leftover fabric and multimedia in this kind of more freeform style. And so I think this is just to illustrate this vernacular aesthetic that we can identify as distinctly African American and distinctly a product of this creolized design process, a process and a sensibility that quilters continue to work into this day.